Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is the UNC Cleantech Summit, and we have a 1-hour webinar today. We have a distinguished group of panelists. The topic is the future of ports. We're going to talk about clean tech. We're going to talk about the drive towards digitization and how it applies to ports. We're going to talk about infrastructure investment and also some new economy jobs. This is a webinar not because of the pandemic that we're in. It's a webinar because we're making up a snow day from our actual Clean Tech Summit in late February, which seems like it was so long ago. Just a reminder to all the participants that this session is being recorded and it can be replayed back. UNC will follow up with an email. What we ask to do is during the session is that if you have questions, just use the Q&A session option, and I will go through the questions and compile them and read them back. Okay. So who do we have today? Is I'm from See Ahead, Mark Wong, co-founding managing director. I will moderate. Our panelist is Kit Cho, vice president of sustainability in the Port of Virginia. Lincoln Wood, electrification policy manager at Southern Company, and Stefan Note, from the director of digital ventures at Wärtsilä, who's kind enough to stay up late for us because he's calling in from Germany. So maybe I'll start quickly on just who See Ahead is. My background quickly, I was trained as a marine engineer, naval architect, but I really spent about 10 years with GE in the energy capital group working on, it wasn't called clean tech back then, but electrification as well as renewable energy, and making strategic venture investments for General Electric. And what we're excited to do about See Ahead is our belief is that intersection now between technology and clean tech now can be really brought to bear in the ocean economy. So at See Ahead, we are based out of Boston. We are a hub. So what's a hub? One, we're launching an incubator with the New Aquarium, very early stage startup ideas that can come out of whether that be the ocean research community or out of Cambridge or the affiliate nearby schools, anything from aquaculture, green ports, green shipping, an underwater focus for smart city, ocean plastics, and the toughest one, of course, is climate change. And then, of course, offshore renewable energy. We also are trying to better connect the investment world to these emerging blue tech, so-called blue tech startups. So we've created our first Blue Angel event, and our second session is in June, where we're connecting interested investors with these startups that we're seeing starting to emerge and get more momentum. So let's talk about ports. Some background information is maybe many have heard this point before, that global trade, roughly 90% of global trade is on something that floats, a ship or a boat. So it's a big part of our global economy. It's the backbone, but very much because it's over the horizon, hasn't been thought of a lot. So the vessels, where do they have to go? They have to go to ports today. So what's happening in our global ports today, and hence why the interest, and why this webinar, and why some of the topics we're going to talk about today. So let's to quickly go through some of the high-level bullet points. One is the traditional, what you call the criteria emissions, sulfuric acid, smog, particulate matter, all of these type of pollutants that have been heavily regulated on land in energy or land-based transportation are just starting to be accelerated on the global shipping and port sector. So the sector has to respond to that. There's also some unique environmental aspects to ports and shipping that land-based transportation or energy doesn't have. For example, invasive species that come from ballast water. When you rebalance your vessel in Shenzhen, and you're rebalancing the vessel as you offload in the Port of Long Beach, all the critters that are so much in the South China Sea that are in your bilge cannot be dumped into California, and vice versa. There's anti-fouling issues using certain chemicals that are being regulated because they're harmful to particularly estuaries. And then there's a big push in the United Nations with reducing carbon. This is looking at reducing carbon by 50% in global shipping by 2050. That's a big nonlinear target for the shipping sector. And in the ports, if you take a systems approach, have a big role in the future of decarbonization with shipping. Just another comment on the IMO is interesting is that shipping, it's not intuitive necessarily, but shipping, unlike energy and land-based transportation globally, actually has a global regulator, which is the United Nations. Not perfect, but there is a global regulator called the UN IMO. The second bullet point is almost every industry in the world today is facing digitization. Healthcare takes the biggest attention. It's the biggest part of the global GDP, at least in the US, it's almost 15%. So the shipping sector and the port sector is no different. Can you digitize logistics, increase efficiency? Can you digitize your compliance and make it more efficient? Of course, as you digitize, you're going to have to look at cybersecurity, and then in parallel to the tech angle is the physical hardware, particularly digital sensors, making it cheaper and easier to collect a lot more data. The third is shipping and port by definition are the gateway to the world. So there's always the Homeland Security question today. So that's about security and compliance. The fourth, which we'll hear about as well, is coastal resiliency. Ports are waterfront property with climate change and rising sea level. And what are the issues? Not easy problems to tackle today. The other is the traditional urban waterfront and the issues there is particularly the urban areas. You have storm runoff, oil, nitrates, pharmaceuticals, all the other types of pollutants that when it rains particularly flow out to the water. They're starting to be heavily regulated as well. So, and there isn't a lot of data that's actually on or under the water, unlike traditional smart city, which is usually street level. And then lastly is economic growth, particularly for us on the East Coast of the US. We're going to talk about offshore wind. It doesn't come along very often, but there's an opportunity to really create good, solid, resilient working class jobs along the US East Coast tied to offshore wind. They can tackle some of the issues we have socially, such as income inequality. We'll talk a bit about that. Just to make it a little more real, just pulled a couple sample headlines. This was in 2017, the Port of Long Beach in LA announced they're going to spend $14 billion to clear air pollution. This is not climate change. This is not carbon. This is not coastal resiliency. This is just simply smog and particulate, not simply, of course. But it just shows you the amount of investment that is starting to go into our ports with one of the topics that I mentioned. This one's criteria emissions. The second is what I just talked about on offshore wind. There's many numbers out there, but this is a big number of an estimate of how much money is going to be spent in the next 10 years on the East Coast for offshore wind. So other people have asked around innovation, which is what we focus on, is we'll give us some examples of what technologies and are out there with regard to BLUETECH and ports. This is Duro is out in the Bronx, and it is a member company of See Ahead. They are an autonomous underwater vehicle, but it's not tied to the Navy. They're really focused on the East River. So what happens in the East River? They're interested in urban pollution, as I mentioned. They're interested in underwater infrastructure to get a better sense of the status of what's the status of the bridges. New York City, as a response to Hurricane Sandy, is building a large berm for the next hurricane. There's needs to be more ocean data. But here's an example of a smart city play that's underwater. And by the way, it's not necessarily just tied to the Navy, which has been the historical customer in the funder for autonomous underwater vehicles. Another example on Vector is this is a Cleantech company working out of Boston. They use plasma water treatment. They're looking at fighting leachate, landfill. They're looking at PFAS and all the traditional Cleantech sectors of water. Why is it relevant to BLUETECH? Well, we've helped them test their technology to see if it can help address the issue of the ballast water, which I mentioned earlier. And they have an independent test from a university saying it does meet the specs as defined by the U.S. Coast Guard. So as that's environmental regulation starts to have a second life and starts to increase, this company is an example of crossover technology from Cleantech that can apply to the water. Lastly, then I'm going to hand it over to my panelists, is just here's one thesis what makes this today's ports and shipping for us so interesting. So what does electric cars have to do with the future of ports? Well, I started looking at electric vehicles with General Electric more than 10 years ago. The number of the cost point for the lithium-ion battery packs that were on the market right then, more than 10 years ago, was over $1,100 a kilowatt hour. Here we have this report has 2013 at 663. Look at where the price curve is and the cost is today. So automobiles today have to be, they have to cycle, they have to be relatively safe, they have to last, they have to be affordable. So that investment from the automotive space raises a question as that cost curve continues to go down and the performance curve continues to go up. What can it mean for our waterfront? And here's a hypothetical. It's not a hypothetical, actually, it's a real example. Just there's many press releases. So this value proposition, which Wärtsilä, I'm sure you know all very well in Northern Europe, is now starting to be looked at on the East Coast and the West Coast. And it would not have been as economical, let's say, even as 5 years ago, both on performance and cost of the batteries. So with that said, I will now hand off to Kit from the Port of Norfolk.
All right, Mark, thanks. I appreciate that. And while the slides are coming up, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Kit Chope. I am the Vice President of Sustainability at the Port of Virginia. That's actually my last slide, Mark. Within my portfolio are engineers, our environmentalists, coastal resiliency is part of the portfolio, dredging, and then we're going to talk a little bit about offshore wind and some other kinds of components like that. So let's see, one more slide, and I think we're going to be there, Mark. While that's loading, one more up. So the Port of Virginia is the third largest port by volume on the US East Coast, and we pass through about 3 million what we call 20-foot equivalent units. Those are those kind of half containers in calendar year 19. Third biggest on the East Coast. If you can go back to, Mark, would be helpful if that works. The primary mission of the Port Authority and for the port is to foster and stimulate growth for Virginia's economy. I don't think that's any surprise to anybody in here, and we do it in a variety of ways through the creation of jobs, the attraction and development and growth of businesses, and clearly the movement of cargo. I would contend, and I'm a little biased here, that Virginia's ports and waterfront are the most diverse in North America. We have, again, the third largest container port in the East Coast. We have the most dynamic, the most mature ship repair and shipbuilding complex in North America. We have the world's largest naval station adjacent to our largest terminal, and 40% of US coal comes out of our harbor. So ultimately, you can see some of the impact there in the slide, and the kicker is 1 in every 10 jobs across the Commonwealth of Virginia is tied to the waterfront. So when I say what's good for the port is good for Virginia, I'm going to come back to that. Next slide, please, Mark. And when we talk about green ports, it's not one program, it's not one initiative, it's not one technology. The port industry is an old industry, but we're embracing innovative technologies and new ways of moving cargo at what I'll call the right pace of technology. Sometimes there's a risk of mission failure if you go too far too quickly. And so I think the right pace of technology is how I would describe that. There are multiple mutually supportive benefits and initiatives that we undertake. And we do it because sustainability is one of the port's 6 anchor values. And there you see responsible stewardship. And it's not just about the environment. It's about the relationships we enjoy inside and outside our fence lines. It's about the health and safety of our colleagues and our port partners. And it's also about fiscal responsibility. But most importantly, it's how those 4 pillars of stewardship are woven together. And why is that important for a port? Well, what we do is inherently dirty, dangerous, and noisy. And we have to earn what I think a lot of folks would recognize as our social license to operate, demonstrating that we're a good neighbor, and so that the communities that surround our facilities allow us to continue to do that. And what I'd just say, and this is the plug for our port and our values, is we do it because we want to, not because we have to. So the next slide, I'm going to walk through quickly some of the different technologies and initiatives that we've undertaken. So I don't think it's any surprise that most cargo, most containers flow on and off of port facilities via truck. at the Port of Virginia, we move more containers via train by percentage than any other port in the US East or Gulf Coast. And so why is that important? Trains are safer, they're more efficient, they've got greater efficiency in ton miles per gallon when compared to dray trucks or over the road trucks. We also move another 3% of our containers via a barge between our facilities here in Hampton Roads and our Richmond Marine Terminal. Again, 3 times a week it goes back and forth, and that's a 450% increase in ton miles per gallon compared to the trucks. Safer, less wear and tear on the roads, less congestion, and obviously less emissions. So I think that's important. But for those trucks that are on the road, there's our Green Operator Program. Our Green Operator Program, you can see our logo there in the upper left-hand corner, was the first voluntary dray truck replacement program in America. Dray trucks are those kind of short-haul truckers that go from our terminals to the distribution centers and warehouses. Since 2006, that program has enabled more than 500 trucks to be scrapped and replaced with cleaner technologies that's resulted in significant reductions in those kinds of pollutants that Mark talked about earlier. Similarly, on terminal, we're capitalizing on zero and low emission cargo handling equipment. There on the bottom, the kind of long landscape looking picture are rail mounted gantry cranes, wholly electric, very quiet, very safe. We were the first in North America to incorporate those into one of our facilities. And right now we're in some enormous investments in infrastructure and equipment to capitalize on that technology. To complement those electric rail mounted gantry cranes, just above it and kind of to the left, you can see another blue piece of cargo handling equipment. Those are called shuttle carriers, and those are hybrids. We piloted a program about 5 years ago through a Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant from the United States Environmental Protection Agency to take advantage of the battery-powered hybrid shuttle carriers. And that pilot gave us the confidence to migrate our entire fleet of that kind of equipment to hybrid technology. The fleet now totals more than 50 and is growing. It's not just equipment. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see an aerial view of what is our new Northgate complex at our largest terminal. We invested $42 million in that truck portal, which not only increases gate capacity, but it increases the velocity through the gate. So that's less idling time. There are 26 new lanes that go in and out of that facility. It's complemented by a $169 million Virginia Department of Transportation Federal Highway Intermodal Connector Highway project. So what that's done since it opened 3 years ago almost is it takes 700 trucks a day off of the side streets in Norfolk, Virginia. Again, congestion, traffic, emissions, wear and tear. Next slide, please, Mark. So I alluded a little bit to some of the technologies, the infrastructure. We have 2/3 of $1 billion in infrastructure and equipment projects ongoing right now. One of them's to that facility you see right there. We also have a $350 million dredging project to take the Norfolk Harbor down to 55 feet. Hampton Roads is the #2 region in the United States for sea level rise, and it's due to myriad reasons. But the short point there is you're investing $1 billion and you're #2 in the threat. So what are you doing to protect that investment? And how are you investing your taxpayer dollars wisely? And so what I would say is I suggested in my opening slide that what's good for the port is good for Virginia. So I think you could understand that what disrupts the port disrupts and has far-reaching impacts across Virginia and beyond. We do enjoy a symbiotic relationship with the water, and we've taken many steps, you can see them listed there, to ensure we can operate not only in an environment characterized by storms of increasing intensity, duration, and frequency, but also across the entire design life of that project with respect to sea level rise. We hold ourselves to high standards, and we hold our construction and design firms to high standards. And we've had third-party analyses of the different projects that we've got to balance that criticality of a feature against the vulnerability. Because at the end of the day, coastal resiliency and what you do about it is all about risk. Next slide, please, Mark. So ultimately, despite the $1 billion worth of investments, we only control the first and last mile that container moves between where something was fabricated or created on the other side of the world and where it will be consumed in Target or Walmart or wherever. So we are wholly dependent on an external system of networks, whether it's the roadways that get our colleagues and our cargo on and off the facilities, obviously the telecommunications, electrical power, distribution networks, we don't own those. And so what I would say is this is a team sport. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see some of the many partners with whom we collaborate on a daily, weekly basis to keep the port, the economy, and our communities vibrant and strong. Next slide, please, Mark. And Mark alluded to this before, offshore wind. So I'm not going to read the Virginia advantages. That's the kind of the glossy that folks here in Virginia would like to tout to the different wind energy providers and talk about why Virginia is a good fit for them. But I will say that that industry has gained momentum very rapidly, especially along the mid-Atlantic and north in the last few years, and ports up and down the coast are hoping to capitalize on that growing industry. For example, Dominion Energy and Ørsted have partnered on what we call the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project. That's the development of 2 6-megawatt turbines about 27 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach. They're the first turbines in federal waters and will be operational later this year. What are we doing as a port to capitalize on that? Earlier this year, the Virginia General Assembly budgeted $40 million to transition our Portsmouth Marine Terminal from a focus on moving containers to a focus on staging and construction of wind energy components. And additionally, Ørsted, who you all recognize as a leader in wind energy across the planet, has entered into a long-term lease with us for part of that terminal, which will last for at least another 6 years to support projects up and down the East Coast. So for those of you who were at Cleantech back before the snowstorm canceled our panel, the preceding panel was comprised of representatives from Ørsted and Dominion and others, Siemens Gamesa, to talk about that. As you know, the states and the energy service providers establish increasingly aggressive renewable energy goals, and we're happy to talk about that more. So last slide, please, Mark. So as I've said, there's no single solution to minimizing your impact on your environment and the surrounding communities. There have to be multiple lines of effort ranging from equipment to engagement, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Lincoln?
Thank you, Mark. As my slides getting pulled up, I'll introduce myself a bit. So I'm Lincoln Wood, Electrification Policy Manager at Southern Company. And in case you don't know, Southern Company is an electric and gas utility, and we serve 9 million customers through our electric and gas utilities around the U.S. For the purposes of this discussion, our 3 electric companies, Alabama Power, Georgia Power, and Mississippi Power, they have many ports in their service territory, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those and kind of what we're doing. First, a little bit about me. I joined the company 14 years ago, so in utility speak, I'm still a newbie. And I actually joined the company in the marketing area, working on customer surveys and focus groups and really understanding what the customer interaction was like and what customers expected of us. Along the way, I moved into a policy role, but it had to do with utility policy and not electrification. I actually got into the electrification space as a result of internal competition around innovation at Southern Company that we called SoPrize. It was modeled after XPRIZE, where we're given a vision of the future of the utility business model, and we were asking, how would you change it? And long story short, 1,000 ideas later and some crowdsourced voting and then reviews by our CEOs, I was part of one of the winning teams that our idea moved forward. It's out on Southern Company's website. The idea is called Revolution, and there should be a booklet out there if you're interested in reading more. So all that to say, my career path has not been one that I probably could have predicted, but it's been a lot of fun, and I really enjoy what I'm working on. So let's talk about ports, for example. In our territory, we've got the Port of Savannah, the Port of Brunswick, Port of Mobile, and Port of Gulfport, among others. And these ports impact our lives in ways you may not always notice. For example, if you had bananas for breakfast this morning, that banana, and you're on the East Coast, that banana more than likely came through the Port of Gulfport. So when we think about electrification and e-mobility and electric transportation, however you want to call it, usually people go first to the on-road side, especially the light duty side of that. So that would be represented by the EV at the bottom right on the slide. For ports specifically, there are other additional equipment, medium and heavy duty trucks that will be all electric, and those are under development and in testing now. That'll be really helpful in reducing emissions and moving goods out of the port, and they will be much quieter. But really, in terms of electrification at ports, the big opportunity comes down to what I call off-road, and that is the equipment that's used to move the cargo around a port. So some examples you've got here are gantry cranes, you've got forklifts, and then not shown but very important ship-to-shore cranes. So Mark kind of hit on this from the Cleantech angle right as we started the webinar. There are a lot of reasons to electrify port equipment, but two major ones are fuel costs and emission reductions. So generally, before coronavirus, typically electricity would be much cheaper to operate than diesel. For example, here in Georgia, for on-road, I usually use the talking point that it equates out anywhere from $1 to $1.25 per gallon, gasoline equivalent. But when you think about the equipment imports, the real issue is standby power. So if you think about a gantry crane, for example, it's already quote unquote electric because it uses electricity to operate, but that electricity is supplied by a diesel generator. And even when the gantry crane is not in use, the diesel generator still has to run so that that power is available at any point in time. So that's, you know, more fuel being used, that's more emissions being created. If there's a way to connect that gantry crane directly into the electricity grid, then it's much quieter. It gets rid of the need for diesel fuel. You don't have standby power issues. The power is just there and it's available whenever the gantry crane needs to use it. And if you think about that, the energy demand, you know, for utilities, it's better for us it's using our assets more effectively. And it's actually a large amount of energy. So if you think about a ship-to-shore crane, when it's in operation, unloading cargo from a ship, at peak, I guess, or maximum loading, the instantaneous demand is something like 1.3 megawatts, which, just for comparison, that's about a Walmart supercenter or a similar sized retail store, all at once. So in addition to, I guess, connecting directly into the grid, let's talk about battery technology for a minute. Mark kind of keyed this up at the beginning of our webinar. And it's absolutely right. Costs are coming down and battery technology is continuously improving. For ports specifically, there isn't always a battery for each duty cycle. So let's think about for a minute how a battery works. There's the total energy storage capacity of the battery itself, the total amount of energy the battery can instantly release, and then how much energy it can sustain over time. There's some applications that just don't work yet for electrification because there isn't a feasible battery solution. And one example is something called a side pick. It picks up shipping containers and moves them around the port. It's a small piece of equipment and it needs to move a lot. So directly wiring it into the electric distribution grid isn't really feasible. It needs a large amount of stored energy because the containers it has to pick up are very heavy. And it does this all day long. So that's a very taxing usage pattern. There's no battery that exists yet that is small enough to fit within the footprint that can supply that much energy for 8 hours or more. So, you know, while we've made lots and lots of progress, there's still areas of improvement. And because we're doing this via webinar and Mark can't throw something at me, I snuck in one extra piece of equipment on the slide, and that's the tug at the bottom center of the screen. This equipment's actually used at an airport, and it's the tug that pushes the plane away from the gates and moves it out onto the taxiway. So that's a different type of port, but the application is the same. The same reasons apply of why you would electrify. And actually here in Atlanta, at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, Terminal F, our international terminal, is completely electric. The terminal itself is electric. All ground support equipment is electric. And it had to be that way for air quality and emissions problems. If we had used traditional diesel there, the terminal expansion would not have been permitted to go forward. So just a little bit of extra history there, no extra cost. That's all for me for the moment. I look forward to your questions. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Lincoln. Stefan, would you like to introduce yourself as I pull up your slide?
Yes, thanks. My name is Stefan Knopf. Wärtsilä in Germany. I'm Digital Ventures, and I'm taking care of startup collaboration for Wärtsilä. Wärtsilä is a Finnish technology company, and we have activities in the marine and energy sector. And I look forward to tell you something what I do here in the marine sector. So if you hear what also the others have told you, that of course it's pretty much that we are aiming towards a zero emission and smart marine ecosystem, and that's what I would like to give you some indicators as of today. As we are here also closely working together with startups within venturing, this is of course something where we have a very good and close relationship with Spearhead and with activities Mark has already outlined. Next slides, please. Okay, so Wärtsilä's purpose is to enable sustainable societies by smart technology. And that's something where we started 2 years ago together also with our businesses to think about how could we fulfill that purpose in our way of working and doing business. And in the energy business, we clearly foresee that we are aiming towards a 100% renewable energy system. Things what we can see right now also with offshore wind, energy storage system and others is quite important for us. Wärtsilä, as you might know, we are providing the large engines for power plants, and that is actually also the core machinery also for the marine business. For the marine business as such, we have a smart marine ecosystem envisioned where we have connected assets around the globe where also we can make a step change with our industries. Wärtsilä is a company with around about 19,000 professionals around the globe. We are active in 200 locations in 80 countries. So what we do here with our technology really can support the change within the industry to a more sustainable way of working and doing business. Next slide, Mark. And so what does that mean in the context of ports? In particular, if you see the marine business and the marine industry, we have a lot of vessels around the globe. They have a life cycle of around 20 to 30 years. So first of all, if we go for digital and new technologies, we somehow need to bring quite a number of existing equipment into the new environment. For us, as an equipment provider, it's quite important here that we first of all get connectivity on the vessels. Connectivity means that we get data from the vessels, data points to improve the way our machinery is operated, that we can help the fleet operators how they manage their fleet, and also the captains how they navigate on their voyage. That's not a standard yet. It's something that's significantly improved. And if you can provide connectivity to the vessels, you have a much broader perspective on how you operate in the industry and how you connect the industry also to Internet of Things and other areas here in the industry. If you talk about connectivity, there comes another issue in this context, that's cybersecurity. We have so many moving atoms around the globe, and we are handling so much cargo that of course all of our customers and who is operating in ports or operating a vessel, they clearly would like to avoid any risk that in their operation a cyber risk or other things occur. So we pay a high attention to protect our equipment, to provide services to our customers, that their equipment becomes cyber safe. In the context on how you bring data on board, how you can get access to the data. We provide training for the crews, how they avoid incidents that could cause failures in their operations. And if you see in the last years when cyber incidents happens, that could have a major impact on the operations in ports and in other areas. It's of course also for us then possible, if we go for data and cyber secure operations, to go into improved operations within ports. We have heard that emissions in ports is an issue, and of course also the fuel consumption over a voyage really matters. So it's not standard at the moment that data between ports are exchanged, so expected time of arrival or departure of port sometimes is not clearly communicated. So what we do also with our technology, that we help operators in the port to estimate better the data a vessel arrives, and based on this data also to advise the captains and the crews how they run the machinery, simply to reduce the fuel consumption in the port. On the other side, if the port knows better when a vessel arrives, and they could share the data with all other partners within the port, then of course also the other industries in the port can simply coordinate their workforce better, and they also become more efficient and reduce emissions here. Another thing, of course, is that if you go in more data-related topics, that you also become more autonomous. Autonomous shipping is certainly something we are working on. That is much easier in areas where you have a ferry in a port, or if you have a tugboat or a vessel that operates in a clearly defined route. There, of course, we are working in technologies how you can better.
I think we may have lost.
I'm back again.
Oh, okay. You're coming in much stronger, Stefan.
Yes. Okay. So on what slide? So I was just talking about that we are working also on autonomous ferries and technologies that help the operator on the vessel to reduce risk in their operations, how they work. Another I'm pretty sorry, my line is not stable here. It seems it's on my hand.
Okay, so Stefan, would you like me to take over, or you want to keep trying?
I will last try here, and then of course everything that is related to renewable fuels like LNG, ammonia, or hydrogen is pretty much in our focus, and how we can work together with energy providers to bring e-fuels and different propulsion systems to the industry. It overall will reduce also the emissions in ports, but as also said by the others, it's really a step change, and it really needs
Okay. I think we lost Stefan. You're back.
Okay. And okay, take over, Mark, please.
Okay. All right. Stefan, I think we lost you where you were talking about alternative fuels, and before that you were talking about autonomous vessels. Big topics. Well, thank you all. So we have a few questions. The first question is from Diane Durrance from UNC, and the question is for Kit. How are you collaborating with the universities in your area? And if I could tag along to Diane's question, I can't help but ask this question because of See Ahead, right? You have a few ports in the world like Rotterdam with an accelerator called Port Excel. You have Pier 71, which is the Port of Singapore. You know, maybe the dock in Israel, but you do have a few ports as well in the world who are looking kind of embrace this concept of open innovation. So they actually work with startups in any type of innovation tied to what I just mentioned. So if I could add that to Diane's question about how are you collaborating with universities, and then are you working with it like in the innovation ecosystem?
Those are good questions, and I appreciate that. So the short answer is we have to. I talked about it's a team sport. We are exceptionally fortunate to have Old Dominion University just down the road from our headquarters and not too far away from our largest terminal. Old Dominion has an entity attached to it called the Virginia Modeling, Analysis, and Simulation Center. It does cutting edge types of modeling and simulations. So I'll give you an example of a couple of ways that we've worked with them. As we began to invest $350 million of taxpayer money into our largest terminal and transition it from kind of legacy diesel, what I'll call manual equipment, to that electric rail mounted gantry crane type technology, we did have some concerns with inundation and coastal flooding. And so not purely from an academic perspective, but also a practical perspective, we partnered with Old Dominion and with VMask specifically to model different scenarios against the proposed lifespan of that project, so that we could in fact answer with full truth and disclosure, yes, we are doing the right thing. Old Dominion's been leading the discussion on this for quite some time. In 2014, the White House funded an intergovernmental pilot project in a couple places around the country, and one was here to talk about the approach to what I'll call a whole of community and a whole of government avenue to dealing with coastal resiliency. That transition into a couple different entities. One is let me make sure I get the name right, because that would be bad, to the Commonwealth Center for Recurrent Flooding Resiliency that is hosted at Old Dominion University. So again, we work with them very closely on a weekly basis. So Mark, when you talk about, and by the way, Diane, there are other universities. You've got the Virginia Institute of Marine Studies up in Gloucester that's tied to William and Mary, Virginia Tech, the University of Virginia. Other universities have footprints in the conversation. When you talk about accelerators, or maybe not incubators isn't necessarily the term, a couple come to mind. One's called RISE. RISE was funded through the National Disaster Resilience Competition a few years ago, and it's headquartered here in Hampton Roads, and it leverages assets and networks to develop, demonstrate, and scale up innovations that help coastal communities adapt to changing climates. They have some seed money, and they do a competition. Folks come in and compete for that seed money, and then they begin to incubate that and move that into prime time. We here in Virginia firmly believe that since we are kind of the epicenter, or one of the epicenters for coastal flooding, we ought to be the epicenter for solutions to coastal flooding. And then more specifically, not entirely unlike the dock that you allude to, Mark, Old Dominion has a spinoff, or has a peripheral called Open Seas. And Open Seas in the same avenue has a diverse representation that wants to tackle those wicked problems and understand how to leverage the resources of this area specifically to address them, and then export those, no pun intended, around the globe to meet other challenges.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Kid. Good. The next question is from Dylan James, and he'd like to know that as you encounter these challenges and the funding, how do you do the clean tech transition for these ports? For investors that want to play a proactive role in accelerating this transition, what are some of the financing investment opportunity needs? I think that might apply to any one of you, the three panelists, right? You have a port operator, and we have the utility, and then of course you have the corporate, which is leading a lot of the new solutions. So yeah, if any one of the panelists like to go take that question. Financing.
Maybe I can pick it up from here. Also in reference to the first question, we have several ecosystems around the globe who are actively supporting investments in new technology and also startups. Pier 71 in Singapore was mentioned, where, for example, there's quite a vibrant ecosystem of investors, port authorities, and others who are trying to shape the future port and also support those investments. You find similar activities in Rotterdam, as mentioned, or in other places where then the local ecosystems trying to shape consortia to bring new proof of concepts and pilots into place. And that's pretty important that you bring partners together over the value chain where they can define new technologies to be approved. It's, for example, for LNG or for autonomous vessels, it's really important that you find an ecosystem that is supportive. Example, in Norway, we have quite a very good ecosystem for autonomous technologies, where you have separate areas in fjords where you can test autonomous routes, technologies, and they also have quite strong restrictions on emissions. So all together drives then innovation, collaboration in those ecosystems.
Yeah, okay. Well, if I could throw this out, and Lincoln and Kit, contradict me if you feel that I'm off, is separate from the innovation part, right? As Stefan mentioned, I think the financing in the U.S. It's the traditional infrastructure type of financing. So what does that mean? Is so if it's a utility and we're doing an electrical upgrade, like let's say ship to shore or shore to ship, right? That I assume is calculated into the rate base. If you're looking at other types of infrastructure investments, whether that be coastal resiliency and or the such, that then a lot of ports in the U.S. I can't speak for Europe, but in a lot of the ports in the U.S. have bonding authority, right? So so I guess my point is that even though Internet of Things and electrification will get a lot of buzz in the startup community, it still falls under traditional infrastructure and how that's financed. Lincoln and Kit, am I stressing a little too far there on that comment?
I think that makes sense, Mark. You also have to remember that there's also the total cost of ownership. And so especially if it's cheaper to operate as electric, or if there's a sustainability goal, that that may just be part of normal operations of what the port is trying to do anyway, of converting over to clean tech. And here in the US, depending on what part of the country that you're in, there may be specific green banks that are set up to provide that sort of financing, depending on sort of, I guess, regional goals is the best way to say it.
Yeah.
And what I might add, Mark, is so we're a little bit of a unique beast here in Virginia, that we are not only the owners of our facilities, we're the operators. And that is a little anomalous in the United States, and I think around the world, that the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey, for example, are the landlords, and then they have tenants who run the facilities. When that's the case, it's usually a public entity that owns and a private entity that operates. And so that allows for a little more maybe flexibility or some other options in funding some of these technologies. Here in Virginia, because we are that hybrid or that unilateral decision maker, it forces us down a path that's maybe a little more narrow with finance options, whether it's General Assembly funded directly. You talked about bonding authority, which we do have. Grants are obviously huge for us. And I used the example earlier of the hybrid shuttle carriers replacing legacy diesel equipment. Much cleaner, a little more expensive, but we understood it was the right technology. Lincoln talked about, or maybe you talked about, does it fit in your sustainability goals? And it absolutely did. And so we were able to convince, the powers that be internally and at the General Assembly that it was important to spend a little more money to understand the cost, not just economically, but in the health benefits along those pillars of stewardship I talked about earlier.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Ken. All right. The next question is from Ryan Wilcoff. Do you see these general trends happening in other transportation hubs like airports and bus hubs? If I could go first, maybe on a thought to that question. Let's go with airports. if you look at all the transportation sectors, I'd argue that we talked about decarbonizing shipping, from Rotterdam to New York, from Hong Kong to California. That you can argue is the second hardest transportation sector to decarbonize. The toughest, airplanes, right? And right now, as Lincoln mentioned, for shipping as well as for airplanes, there is no battery technology that can hit any of the metrics you need. Energy density, power density, and cost, cycle life. So you're really looking at very much nonlinear solutions, which Stefan mentioned, right? The hydrogen economy and alternative fuels, biofuels. And the bus part is, in my sense, is that bus part falls under the traditional, because you are in a municipality, and you're, let's use California, which is the most aggressive, right, for emissions. So you got EPA, then you got California CARB, and if you're in the city of LA, you got the city of LA as well on top of the federal and the state. So the bus usually falls under those programs, reducing NOx, and as Kit mentioned, those diesel emission grants, for example, are applicable, as well as other forms of financing. So you do see a lot of hybrid buses today in alternative fuels, which is good. And in the airports, you actually even see a full electric, and in a blue moon, you might see a fuel cell bus. With that said, that's my 2 cents. Is it Lincoln or anyone else have any thoughts about these trends in airports and commercial transportation?
So this is Lincoln. From my standpoint, absolutely. It's really driven by cost, however. So if you think about an electric bus, the cost of an electric bus might be 2 or 3 times the cost of its diesel counterpart. So there are usually grants that the federal government might have and other nonprofits might issue to help bring that cost down. And I'll give an example. I'm a University of Georgia graduate, and actually my student job when I was at UGA was a bus driver for the campus transit system. So back in the day when I was there, some almost 20 years ago, the buses were turbocharged diesels. UGA actually just brought on campus they're aiming for, I believe, 19 or 20 electric buses. And they did this in response to, I guess, a goal of reducing campus emissions 20% in 2020. And by bringing on the electric buses, it ultimately resulted in something like a 14% reduction of that 20%. So in other words, they only had about 6 or 7% that was left to achieve the goals they were trying to get to. But it wasn't just that. It was maintenance costs for the buses themselves dropped, and the noise on the campus, it was much quieter. And that's just one example in one college in the country. There are many other schools that are also looking at this, as well as other transit agencies, and just trying to work through what the technology looks like, how it works. That's actually an interesting counterpoint in the whole industry of training operators on how to drive them, because they do drive differently, just as EVs drive differently than their gasoline counterparts. But it's a step-by-step process, absolutely. And I do see the momentum of the industry is moving the direction towards clean tech and sustainability and emissions reduction.
Yeah, and if I could add to your last point there, like, and you kind of briefly touched there on workforce development, right? Is a pure electric vehicle has roughly a third of the moving parts of an internal combustion engine vehicle, bus or car, right? And our workforce is structured for the old, right? And so it's a different skill set, right? And as we transition to electrifying, whether that be land-based or the coast or other forms of sea transportation, remains an open question. We got a few more minutes. Maybe if I can take we don't have any more questions. If I could throw one out, perhaps to you, Stefan, right? So Stefan, is the decarbonization of shipping, as well as you're working on digitization in ports, and you're also looking at like microgeneration in ports. So you kind of look at it all, right? And do you think there's a I guess my question is, there a push I'm going to put you in the U.S. side, right? I won't speak for Europe or ask about Europe. Is there a push of more of a systems approach? Meaning, could you create hydrogen from offshore wind at night, or you see where I'm going with that? Is where the traditional silos of energy generation, the port itself, and shipping may feel that together they may, a systems approach might be able to hit some of the targets, the aggressive targets that we're seeing, right, like on decarbonization.
Yeah, I would take reference to this. Decarbonization is one of the high goals of the shipping industry, and it's the only difference that 80, 90 companies joined, for example, the Getting to Zero Coalition to work together on a roadmap to bring emissions significantly down. And one example we are working in a systems approach is in Norway, where we work together with other industry players to think about what could be zero emission energy distribution at sea. How could we bring e-fuels to vessels autonomously or with bunker barges to ports, whatever, but also how we can generate those new fuels to this one. And that's really, that's beyond what we can do as a technology provider. We need a systems approach. We need collaboration with the ports. They need to think about their infrastructure. We need to think about how we operate and how we transfer those new type of fuels. It's a very holistic view where we all need to work together. And if you take the ambition targets of climate change and temperature reduction, it's something where we really need to work together as an industry. And as ports, it's quite important. If, for example, if you go to Hamburg, where we are located, it's a port at the river. And of course, if the city is trying to reduce the emissions, and you have a port in a port in a city, port is part of emission reduction. We can't go for emission-reduced trucks while we have cruise vessels and container vessels still emitting as in the past. So that's where we all need to work together, bringing emissions down and finding new ways. But it also will be not one way. It will be quite some alternatives around the globe where you need to find the best solutions for their needs in the given context.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We're coming on our full hour. Thank you, Stefan, Lincoln, and Kit, and thank you, Julia at UNC. Thank you, UNC, for hosting us. This was a fun snow day makeup. And maybe if I can make a conclusion, particularly that we're hosted by the University of North Carolina, and so if you're out there listening as a student, I think the takeaway is, one is our ports today they play a critical role in our global economy. They are a source of employment. They're the backbone of a lot of the economy, and they are future growth, particularly STEM as well as working class jobs. And as we can see from the diverse group of panelists, we have corporate, we have the utility, and we have the port operator. They're all fighting the good fight. And so ports today, is not necessarily associated in the past, but they are looking at innovation and tackling some of the hardest challenges that we all face. So I consider working on a waterfront. I think it's a great prospect for the future if you're looking at graduating, figuring out what to do next. Thank you again for everybody. And once again, this will be recorded and anybody can play this back, and UNC will send out the details. Once again, thanks to everybody.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.